So on the one hand, I mean, learning increasingly happens in environments which, technically produce lots of data, which have nothing to do with more traditional educational settings, but which are, let's say, online settings, social web environments. We exchange information, knowledge on the web, on Twitter, on Facebook. We use things like SlideShare and the like, and during all these activities, learning actually happens in very different kind of forms. Micro-learning, informal learning are sort of the key buzzwords in that area at the moment, and of course lots of data is being generated because of that. And one challenge, and I think this is also what AFEL is to a very large extent about, is providing techniques which enable us to better understand how learning actually takes place in these kind of environments, and using data which we can obtain, crawl from the web, from learning activities, from all sorts of open and public APIs, in order to better shape the understanding of how learning actually takes place, because this is a really not very well research topic at the moment, and it's in fact a very hard research topic in the sense that when you compare these informal environments, normally you have some indicators about what, for instance, is a good learning behavior and what is a negative learning behavior, or what is a bad outcome. You have assessments. You can actually really use this kind of information to get a better understanding of how, for instance, a learner with a very efficient learning behavior actually behaves, and how that happens in the opposite case. And in these informal learning environments, that's just not there, right? So one big challenge for AFEL, in fact, is being able in these huge amounts of data to detect what actually is a learning activity, because this is in fact also very hard to say. I mean, we exchange information, but is any kind of knowledge exchange, for instance, in a social environment, is any kind of video lecture or video I watch already containing an actual learning outcome in that sense? And to a very large extent, AFEL is really about providing the techniques which help us in better differentiating what is actual learning, how can we detect that, and all these kind of resources, and how can we better support that. That's also a very good question. So in the long term, of course, we don't want to understand only how learning happens, but we want to provide the right tools which enable people to support learning in that sense. So if I know, for instance, there is a negative learning behavior, or there is a user who is trying to find a certain kind of information, maybe in some kind of narrative or following some kind of learning outcome, and just from the behavioral pattern I can detect that this user is actually struggling doing exactly that, we aim to provide techniques like recommender systems or improved search mechanisms which provide people with the better, with a improved user experience, with more efficiently finding the kind of information they actually need, and providing them a better understanding of, let's say, a specific topic they want to learn about. And I think this is something which in the project we are currently doing for a very specific learning platform, which is our KNOS platform, which is a very large-scale Spanish social network. But in the long term, of course, we want to reach out to other environments, to other providers of platforms to, in fact, evaluate and test similar mechanisms. I would definitely say yes. There are quite a few things the consortium can be proud of. On the one hand, I mean, given that we are in the first year, data collection has been a very huge effort. So one big objective for the first year was to obtain as much user activity data from the web, which we can get. So from all sorts of platforms and environments. User activity data on the one hand, because we want to analyze and understand how people actually use use learning resources on the web, and at the same time activities usually involve knowledge resources, let's say a video or a slideshare, slide set, and these kind of things. So we also need to shape a better understanding of what are the resources which are actually involved, and that of course means we need to acquire data for both, and that is already a tangible outcome which is currently taking shape. So in a few months time we should be able to actually release a pretty decently large data set, and to our understanding this is currently not just from a pragmatic perspective, but also for the research community, in fact, a very big gap. So also in the learning analytics community and the education and data mining community, having access to a larger amount of data sets on which to, for instance, evaluate learning analytics tools or compare performance of particular learning analytics mechanisms is in fact a very important issue. And so this is again something we're planning to collaborate with different communities to also really advertise the data set in itself and in its own right. So I think this is already a very tangible and nice outcome, I think, for the first period. On the other hand, and I think this is also a fairly positive outcome from AFEL, that there have been quite a few initial research results which are in fact very interesting. So there are many collaborations between different partners going on at the moment. So one very interesting recent paper submission was, for instance, on trying to detect learning activities, and in particular trying to detect or distinguish competent users from incompetent users, competence being a very important notion from a learning perspective as well, from the mouse movements and the keystrokes from users on the web, right? So we had set up some fairly large experiments where we collected all that data. We had some mechanisms to actually generate some kind of ground truth on what is in fact a user, which is sort of getting along pretty well with the task, what is a user who is sort of struggling, and we developed a classifier which is able with a fairly high precision to detect plainly from the mouse movements, the keystrokes from a particular user, whether that is a competent one or an incompetent one. So this kind of distinction actually goes much further. We have a fairly sophisticated typology of users, but in simple terms, that is one of the key outcomes. And I think this is, from my point of view, a very important result, and a very nice result also because it's very much in the AFEL spirit, in the sense that it enables us in very learning independent data and in very unstructured information to detect notions which are very important for learning. And I think this is specifically for the first periods in AFEL a very important task as well. I would love to say yes. Looking at certain kind of tendencies and lots of discussions we see, I think there is a very reasonable question to ask about to what extent actually technology has the opposite effect, right? I mean, there are lots of interesting articles and studies, for instance, about the negative impacts of the echo chamber effect, which I think is a very important notion these days, which actually has an impact on society and politics, and how humanity deals with certain topics and problems, which is strongly affected by technology. And this is in fact another important topic we are currently dealing with in AFEL as well. So this is one of the notions we're also investigating. We're actually running some experiments on trying to detect, for instance, biased resources, which is of course supported also by certain kind of online behavior, that there are these assumptions that of course like-minded people tend to share the same kind of or resources or documents or content which is of course supporting the same kind of point of views on the web. And this is, of course, something which also has a very strong impact on learning, for instance. If you learn, of course, resources which always reflect, let's say, on a very historical topic, a very particular opinion, you might get a very biased understanding of a certain topic. And so this is another research questions or another set of research questions we are currently asking, and where I think the question of whether technology actually makes us smarter or not is yet to be answered. But I think it's a very reasonable question, and I think one thing is safe to say that technology certainly has a big impact on how humanity as a whole is going to evolve, and how the wisdom of humanity is going to evolve. And AFEL might eventually play a small part in that as well.